Hi, everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't be in class today, but this is a good opportunity to get a little bit more caught up in lecture because obviously we're super behind. So right now I'm going to record several little tinier subsets and of lectures that I'm behind on. This is the first one. And so we're going to be looking at how the elites of the Roman world converted to Christianity. Obviously, you can see I'm following this theme all along of like looking at the kind of religious sentiments of the late Roman world and noticing that we're not really talking about religion as this like isolated thing. So whether we're talking about Daniel the Stylite and how he's helping people in the localities, sort of local culture, or whether we're talking about the highest elites and how they use Christianity politically, Christianity is something that is involved in all aspects of life. So I want to just give a kind of show and tell. If you guys weren't with me and it was not COVID times, I have a couple coins and they're cool. So this is one of Constantine, so the first Christian emperor. And we've obviously discussed him. And then here's a coin of Julian the Apostate. And you can't make out the iconography, but maybe I'll try a little harder here. There is a Magna Mater there. So there's a big bowl on it. And that's, of course, his mystery cult. So he was a worshiper of the cult of Magna Mater. And I think that's really cool. Someday we'll be able to all get together and see these things. I'm going to share the screen right now and go to the PowerPoint that I showed you last time. We already went through the pictures in it. So I'm going to post the outline or this PowerPoint separately to D2L. And therefore, if you want, you could just print it out or, have it on a different screen, slow things down and use it at your own pacing. I'll pretty much follow the outline because I feel like that's the most helpful thing when you're just listening to a lecture that's recorded like this. And what we're going to see, the big picture that I'm going to emphasize is that there's this conversion process that happens in the 4th century. So throughout the 300s that we already started with Constantine. And while in the beginning, it's very much Constantine's Edict of Milan saying anybody can worship however they want. By the end of the 4th century, there's a full-on attempt by the leadership of the Roman world and the Byzantine world to end paganism. So religious intolerance. But along the way, I'm going to cover this kind of pagan backlash, and it's not really very effective. So we're going to look at how some pagans really wanted to keep up a non-Christian religiosity, and they rejected Christianity in both the East and the West. And then I'm going to explain why that failed. And that's the bigger thing, is the fact that the elites, by the middle of the 4th century, a lot of their culture had blended pagan and Christian ideas, making the transition to Christianity much more easy for elites to have happen. So we're beginning with Julian the Apostate as an example of resistance to Christianity in the East, in the Eastern Roman Empire, which of course is Byzantium to us. And that example is through this really fascinating guy. And we're going to be obviously talking about Missappogon, or beard hater, in class on Tuesday. The apostate is what Christians later call him because he was born out of a Christian family and rejected it in favor of paganism. It's really, really interesting, his story. So this is the example of resistance to Christianity in the East. And Julian only ruled for a couple of years. He had a very unusual upbringing. You might remember in class, I mentioned that when Constantine died, there was a civil war among the emperors, and who should succeed was debated. Julian's father and his brother were both murdered in this civil war, and it left a real impression on him. Obviously, he didn't like that, and he himself was sequestered away in isolation, so that he was raised almost in a bubble. or very much actually in a bubble, by a tutor who was Greek-speaking, philosophy-loving pagan. He was a Neoplatonist. So I'm going to be talking about Neoplatonic ideas. I already talked about the basic, what's Plato with the allegory of the cave. And I'm going to be talking more specifically about some Neoplatonist ideas, but suffice it to say at this point that Julian really was influenced by this. And he came to think that, the pagan religion would be much better than Christianity. I have the term Constantius II there, who died in 361. So that's just the emperor that came before Julian the Apostate. Julian worshiped Magna Mater, and I give that to remind us as an example of the type of Christianity that was popular ever since the 3rd century crisis. Very popular mystery cult. This cult, like other mystery cults after the 3rd century, was offering a kind of immortality. And it also emphasized allegiance and a personal relationship to a deity. And that's, however, different from Christianity in different ways that we've already looked at. In particular, he worshiped Magna Mater, but that didn't mean he didn't also believe in other Roman deities. So there's still polytheism, it's just he had a personal relationship with this one particular goddess. And the Taurobolium I want to show you here. Let's see if I can go, whoops. There's this kind of artist rendition of it. And it would be this ritual bloodbath that you'd take every 7 years. And it was supposed to make you immortal. Didn't work out for Julian, but he tried. So one of the things about Julian that's really fascinating, as you'll see in the writings, is that he idolized the past. And so many times in history, we see people doing this, like thinking that the past is somehow greater. And so for him, he looked back to a time of Marcus Aurelius, who had died in 180. You don't have to know that, I didn't put it as a term, but it's an example of Marcus Aurelius had been a philosopher as well as an emperor. Marcus Aurelius had a long, long beard. So Julian the Apostate also grew a beard, and that was not what other leaders at the time were doing. So that's why he refers to himself jokingly as a beard hater. So one of the things that he liked about his vision of the past is an idealized Roman state in which the wealthy people took care of the unwealthier people, the urban masses, by serving in the cities as kind of protectors. Almost, you can make a comparison with Confucian ideals. And so he really thought that aristocrats ought to serve in public positions in the cities, donate their money and time, and thereby helping all members of society to function. This was really not what was the way Roman societies was structured. Again, Julian was raised in a bubble, far away from what was really going on since the 3rd century, a huge transfer where the elite had, there were lots of elites still in cities, but they really had their money focused in very large latifundia estates. And they weren't expressing their status as much by donating wealth to the cities. So that function was changing, and it was becoming a sort of something the bishops were doing. So Julian was out of touch. And when he writes about what he thinks values should be in Misopogon, pay attention to the things that he's really saying are oh, this is what should be done, and be aware that of the 3rd century crisis and how that's not really the world that he's living in anymore. I want to talk about a few criticisms that Julian the Apostate made against Christianity. These should be familiar to us, but you could write them down. So first of all, he thought that when there's this idea that Jesus comes to earth as a God and then suffers and dies, that was repulsive to him. I've mentioned before, the idea that your God dies on a cross, that's the opposite of a powerful God. So furthermore, Neoplatonist ideas really emphasized eternity, not change and decay. Remember that a lot of pagans had thought that the idea of bodily resurrection for Christians was like zombie fest. So that's one of the things he didn't like about it, that Jesus was a suffering God who died, resurrection, bodily resurrection, all of that went against Neoplatonism. A second criticism that I haven't talked about that you'll see maybe a little bit in Misopogon is an idea that Christians, this is what Julian was saying, they have no reason to be moral because all you have to do is just say you're sorry and then you're done, you're forgiven. So why, be good? There's not a reason. And he himself thought that Christians were really immoral, the ones that he saw in Antioch, for example, the city that he's writing against. So that's the second reason that he was criticizing Christianity. And so the immorality comes out in Misopogon when he's talking about Christians loving the theater, loving the chariot races. Why are you pleasure seeking? It's so this worldly. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's kind of the focus that happens in the 3rd century is a focus on the life after. And you can see Julian the Apostate embracing that, even though he's a pagan. So really, this is the third reason that he doesn't like Christianity. For him, it's an abandonment of the ancient Roman tradition. And those traditions had worked. He thought that they had made Rome strong for years. So it's the same kinds of criticism that Augustine has to fight against when he wrote The City of God. Julian did try to ban Christianity. So he passed edicts saying that temple properties needed to be restored. And he also destroyed a Christian church at Antioch. So he did this in retaliation because Christians had burned down a pagan temple. But nevertheless, he did try to ban it. It totally failed. And in fact, he failed. He was killed by Persians in a battle. And, if he had lived longer, it's sort of a what if of Roman history, one of those places. But a lot of historians think that he probably wouldn't have been successful because the momentum for Christianity was pretty big by his reign. Impossible to know for sure. I want to talk, by the way, in class, I mentioned, I think I said that Julian was writing about Chalcedon. And of course, that's wrong. I'm sorry that if I said that. It was Antioch, was the city that he had traveled to in his attempt to fight against the Persians. So I'm moving to talk about the resistance to Christianity in the West. And just like this first example, what we're going to, with Julian, resistance to Christianity in the East, what we're going to see is that the resistance to Christianity in the West is a failure. And I'm going to go over not just why it's a failure, but what I in particular emphasize in this point are some of the reasons that elite pagans defended paganism. So we just heard Julian's critique of Christianity. Now we're going to hear some pagans' argument in favor of paganism, like a philosophical argument. So in the West, the elites were still structured a little differently in the 4th century than they were in the East. In particular, this Roman senatorial aristocracy had a great deal of power. We remember that Augustus had pretended to share power between himself and the Senate. By the time of Diocletian, the Senate really had no power, and there was an outright claim to autocracy by the emperor. But these families were still around, and they still had a lot of money. And even though there was a Senate in the East when Constantinople was founded, that Senate was really just like a kind of paper cut thing that Constantine had wholesale imported. The Senate of Rome had a longer tradition and had wealth in the localities and had a kind of institutional memory of having power. So those things make it a little different. And perhaps that's why the resistance or the kind of articulated claims of elite pagans to support paganism against Christianity are found really notably among the senatorial aristocracy. It was a whole social class. To be a senator, you had to, it wasn't just a job, it was a family position. And you got your way in by working in certain posts. Traditionally, this had provided some level of support for lower class members of urban societies like the cities, because you showed your social status as a senator by donating wealth to the city. I explained how in much of the Roman world, this was going away because the rich were going to large latifundia estates. In some pockets, though, these senators still dwelled in the urban centers and had close contact with each other. And so with this in mind, I want to mention the career of Symmachus, who was the urban prefect of Rome. And this position, the urban prefect, it would be akin to like a governor of New York, like the city of New York. Obviously, the city of New York is really powerful in the United States, very important center. And so the governor of the city of New York has a lot more influence than, let's say, the governor of Harrisburg. That's just, of Pennsylvania, or let's just say even Idaho, other governors. So Symmachus was extremely from this very, very elite family. I showed you last time that after he died, here's the apotheosis of Symmachus, as though he's being taken up to the heavens as a god. So he would have liked that, no doubt. And you can see this kind of Roman classicizing. It's very interesting. I think the elephants are really interesting because Romans didn't usually see elephants. So the example of a defense of paganism that Symmachus made comes from an attempt to take down a very old symbol of power that had been in Rome called the altar of victory. And you can see that this, I put on the outline, the altar of victory was removed by the Emperor Constantius II in 357. And it had stood in the Roman, places where the senators would have seen it and argued and discussed legislation for a very long time. So Symmachus was, along with other senators, was really sad when it was removed because it was a pagan symbol. He wrote 3 different letters and appealing, trying in 384, 391, 402. I don't care if you know those dates, but all those years he was trying to get the altar back and he failed. But along the way, he made some arguments, and I'm going to give you some of the arguments he makes, why this altar should be allowed to stay. And these arguments provide a kind of pagan logic for preserving paganism among the elites. First of all, it's traditional. It's like follow tradition. So that would be important. We've talked about that with the city of God. Augustine has to talk about, tradition and try to fight against the pagan claims of tradition. So that's the first reason, because it was a tradition. Also, number 2, because other emperors tolerated paganism. After all, the Edict of Milan said that anybody could worship however they wanted. So why should this be changed now? That's the second reason. Saying, okay, there should be religious toleration. Sadly, religious toleration sort of exits the Europe stage for, many, many, many centuries. Third, he argued that they needed it to fight against the barbarians. So there were a lot of different uprisings in Italy. Of course, we know this in the 4th century. And Symmachus was saying, this is the altar of victory, Nike. So why would you take that away? We're going to lose to the barbarians. So it's effective. That's the third reason. Fourth reason, it's ours. He was just saying, why are you doing this? We've had this, the Senate has controlled this for a long time. Fifth reason, it's actually a center of vows to the emperors. Like, wait a minute, at the altar of victory, we give allegiance to you. So wouldn't it take away your power? And the last reason is just this kind of sense of foreboding. Bad things will happen if it is removed. And so that was the last reason. And it never worked. On a midterm, I'm not going to probably ask you, what are 7 reasons why the altar of victory was okay to, should have been kept according to Symmachus. But knowing them is a good idea in that it provides some reasons that paganism still was very vibrant as a religion or a religious expression in the Roman world in the 4th century. So I'm skipping Valentinianus. I want to talk about the pagan backlash of the West, and I'm just going to go through really quickly here because the big news is it's a failure. And what I just want to point out is there's this one battle, and the people that line up on either side at one glance seem to be pagan versus Christian. And on another, when you look deeper, it's actually not that way. So I really should have just included this as one little blip. But the main thing is that the resistance to Christianity, it really wasn't that strong in the 4th century. So here is this particular example. There's this battle called the Battle of Frigidus. And obviously 394, it's the late 4th century. By this time, intolerance was the name of the game in the Roman emperors. So the Byzantine emperors ruling out of Constantinople were wholesale going against paganism. In this battle, a guy called Eugenius, he was a Roman senator, and he allied with a German called Argabast to have a war against the Eastern Emperor. And so the Eastern Emperor was very, very Christian. The outspoken argument made for fighting the battle was largely articulated by the very high up leader called Nicomachus Flavianus, a Praetorian prefect. And Nicomachus Flavianus was a very articulate pagan who was critical of Christianity in the way that Julian the Apostate was. Symmachus wasn't critical of Christianity. He was just begging for pagans. Could be a t-shirt, begging for pagans. So the battle, it was lost. And it seems like if you're like that, you're like, oh, wow, the West are filled with the pagans and they're fighting against the East that are the Christians. But no, that's actually not the way it was. Eugenius actually was a nominal Christian. So he may not have like worn, Christianity, like, actually believed it. But nominally, he was like, yeah, I'm Christian. He just didn't, he would fight with the pagans or the German barbarians if it meant power. And I feel like one of the thing that I would like to have as a takeaway about the Battle of Frigidus is that it really, instead of illustrating pagan versus Christian, the real thing it shows is how in the west of Rome, in the western half of the Roman Empire, what was going on in the 4th century is a radical localization of power, where you want to be powerful people, warlords or senators, warlords, were trying to get like armies to support them so that they could take control. And this is important. I did have to skip the lecture on the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, but old idea, the Germans came in and took over. Better idea is it's much more nuanced, and I'm really not being nuanced by what I'm going to say next, but it's really much more illustrated by a real localization of power, whether that localization was put forward by senators or barbarians. That's what was more responsible for taking apart the West. All right, I'm moving on. And this is the big thing. Okay, so this point is the what really is happening in the 4th century for most people. Most people were not, I wouldn't say, extreme, like intolerant Christians. There definitely were, and we definitely have their sources and their voices more because they survived. And nor were there like extreme radical pagans that were like, we hate Christianity, although those people existed too, and they lost. More, at least in the middle of the 4th century, is this kind of coexistence and of pagan and Christian culture. So whereas in the 100s, rich, wealthy Romans were like, oh, those rubes, those Christians, they're so weird, zombie apocalypse. By the 4th century, the elites of both pagans and Christians had more ideas, more marriages, more culture in common with each other than rich Christians and poor Christians maybe, or rich pagans and poor pagans maybe. So that's what's going on. So I want to go through a few of the reasons, benefits for converting to Christianity. And this would have been something that just shows why pagan elites would have found Christianity appealing. And we've really already gone through this. So, for example, that's where the power is now. After Constantine converts, if you want to get into the circles of power, being Christian really helps. So I have examples. Let's see. Oh, the guy Pomacius, he had converted to Christianity, got a really high position of power. Many senators built churches, and they're building churches instead of the old ways of donating money to like build a secular, or I shouldn't say secular because that didn't really exist, but a kind of traditional state building, state statues in Rome cities. Building a church got you a fancy reputation. And so that's something that elite people could do to get more power and more status. So I also wanted to talk about intermarriage. That's a second reason. And I didn't really talk about that so much, but it shouldn't come as a surprise. Rich pagans and rich Christians were intermarrying with each other. And I just have one example there, the Caioni family. So they're the family that eventually has this woman called Melania the Younger. And it's Meliana the Younger, so I'm sorry I mispronounced that. But Meliana the Younger was the ascetic saint that I talked about in class the other day. So she had been born of a mixed marriage, and she converts to Christianity, and then she herself becomes a really important Christian leader. So that when the pagan elites and Christian elites are intermarrying, what is happening increasingly is that the children are Christian. So that's the second sort of reason why the elite cultures of Christian and pagan are coming together. Third, there's a kind of common material culture. When I say material culture, I mean physical objects, whether you're talking about buildings, whether you're talking about pictures, and so these things of Christians and pagans resemble each other. And I went through last time several of the kind of art pieces here and here and yeah. Those are just two, but really this is a very big, fascinating topic. Really funny is that this is also paralleled in literature, and one of the only extended works of poetry by a woman from this time period is a woman called Proba, and her canto, which means song, it was a cut and paste of Virgil's Aeneid. So she just took the Aeneid, which is a very, very famous poem by Virgil, and Aeneid. I didn't put that term on, but she took it and she just rearranged it to make it tell the story of Jesus's crucifixion, which I find extremely hysterical. So I can't think of an example of that in, like maybe if you took Shakespeare's Hamlet and you cut and paste to tell the story of Trump's presidency. I mean, I don't know, like really very, very odd work of art. And we could call it derivative, but it also is telling because here's this amalgamation of Christian and pagan culture that makes it easier for the elite to convert to Christianity. I want to conclude this section by talking about the ways the philosophies of Christians and pagans were coming together, of the elite in the 4th century. So I have these two examples. These people would have hated each other. Julian the Apostate and Augustine of Hippo, a really extreme pagan and a really extreme Christian. And yet it's fascinating to trace what they had in common. So I'm going to give you a couple reasons. Okay. So what we're going to see is that Neoplatonism, which of course originally, you can tell by the word Plato, comes out of a pagan philosophy, it begins to be something that both Christians and pagans have in common with each other. So here's some examples of common ideas held by Christians and pagans in the Neoplatonic tradition. So you can like pause, take a note on that. Common ideals of Christians and pagans in the Neoplatonic philosophy. Here we go. Okay, 1, the universe is immortal universe. 2, reward of virtue in the hereafter. So this is a big deal. We've talked about there's an idea in the 3rd century that that life after death is more important. But this kind of increasing emphasis on virtue, like your morality is rewarded in an afterlife. That is something that also is happening in the 4th century. 3, perfection of a deity. So there's an increasing emphasis on an idea of a monotheistic deity. Maybe for pagans like Julian, you'd have different almost avatars of gods and goddesses of the pagan tradition, really all reflecting one deity, almost like Brahminical Hinduism, if you remember that from World History 105. I think I'm on, let's see, universe is immortal, reward of virtue, perfection of deity. Okay, 4. There's an idea that the divine is separate from the material world. So there's a dualism, like this kind of city on earth, city of God that Christianity has. Well, the Neoplatonists have that kind of dualism as well. And then this is just a different one because it's not philosophical. It's a specific and new moral change. And I know at least one of us is reading, one of us is reading From Shame to Sin as our book topic. So this idea comes from here. There's a new emphasis against promiscuity that was not part of traditional Roman culture. So too much profligate sex is bad. And it's much more complicated than I have time to go into right now. It's not true that the same sexual morals applied for women and men. And yet, compared to like ideas about sex earlier for men, now there is an idea that male sexuality is something that ought to be monitored, and that in general, having a sexual existence is equated or connected to a sinful nature in some ways. It's fascinating, super fascinating. So, we already went through how Julian thought of this, and we already went through how Augustine thought of this because we talked about this in class, the City of God. So I'm not going to go over it again, but these are some of the ideas. Okay, so just hopefully that's clear. I'm going to, stop this, record the next lecture. And so please take note of any questions you might have. And I'll give a moment in class before we take the quiz or something if you have any specific questions. Also, you can email me. All righty. So have a good day. Maybe you're taking a break between here and the next lecture I record.